Good day, and welcome to another of our Ransford's Weekly Wraps. I'm Viv Govender, and as usual, what we'll do today is go through a few of the stories that came out in the last week or so. We'll do it look different this week. We'll combine our AI story, our usual tech story, into our deep dive of the week. So, what are the three stories we're looking at? Firstly, we're looking at SA inflation. Then we look at the BRICS summit that's currently occurring in South Africa. And then finally, we'll do a deep dive into our AI story, like I said, which is going to be Nvidia results coming out. So let's start off with inflation. So Africa's inflation rate came in at 4.7%, almost at our target of 4.5%. That's a very great improvement from where we were about a year or so ago. Okay, so you would think that there's a good chance that the Reserve Bank might be looking to do something about perhaps even reducing interest rates. Unfortunately, that's not the case. If you look at the current petrol price expectations coming through for the next month, September, we're looking at an increase right now of over R1 for petrol and over R2 for diesel. Obviously, we still have a bit of the month to go by, and there might be some adjustments coming through. But R1 coming through for petrol and another with another R2 for diesel, that does indicate that some inflationary pressures are returning. This is partly due to a couple of things. Firstly, of course, our currency had weakened dramatically. It's strengthened a little recently. We're currently sitting, as I speak to you, at about 1870 rands to the US dollar. A little while back we were at 19 to the US dollar, 19 plus actually. So there's a slight improvement. But if you go back to the start of the month, end of July, we're looking at closer to like 17 some change, or 1750, 1770, around about there. So this has been quite a significant amount of weakness in the currency. We're talking about round about 5, which goes maybe 10% here, 5-10% from where we were before. I mean the exact number, I think it's around 8% or so. That is a lot, in terms of a currency, especially for a country like South Africa, which is dependent on dollar-based imports, oil, etc., etc. The second thing to look at as well is the rise in the petroleum price. A couple of months ago, we had petroleum, Brent crude, for instance, sitting at around about $72 a barrel. We're currently at about 82, 83. We've been as high as like 85, 86 in the last few weeks. But even at 82, 83, we're talking about a movement in double digits, in terms of the price of the underlying petroleum. Those two factors, at the very least, and not even looking at some other things out there, means that there is going to be significant, remaining inflationary pressures on this economy, and that means that the Reserve Bank is probably going to be a bit nervous about, cutting prematurely. The next thing we're talking about right now is the BRICS summits happening in South Africa. BRICS has a number of new members, places like, for instance, Argentina, Saudi Arabia, etc., are joining. On the surface of it, BRICS is a very powerful entity. I mean, we're talking about with the new countries added on, like Saudi Arabia and so on, something in the region of about a group of countries accounting for a third of the world's GDP, 30% or so of the world's GDP. And because of the huge populations of places like India and China, etc., even a larger share of the global population. So we're talking about probably other than the UN, the biggest population organization in the world, a significant economic alliance as well. That being said, the question is how much power do these countries yield, and how much cooperation are we seeing here? Is this like the EU? Is this a case of very strong cooperation, very strong ties, etc., or is it something a little different? I think it's very different actually. The one example I give, the two biggest countries here, obviously there's a big difference in terms of size, with the Chinese being about 4 times larger in terms of their economy than the Indians. But India is like a reasonably large economy, the second largest in BRICS by a margin. It's bigger, like almost twice the size of Brazil or Russia, which is the other, and much larger than South Africa. But if you look at China and India, two biggest populations, two biggest economies, like I said, though, like I said, China is much larger. India is actually in an alliance called the Quad, which is India, Japan, Australia, and the US. And the Quad's main purpose is to actually, monitor and control China and limit China's expansion. So even though India is part of BRICS with China, it's not exactly the friendliest relationship, on all matters. They're not like the US and the UK, which are basically, or the US and Canada or something like that there, which means basically that, very strong correlation in terms of, interest, etc. They do cooperate because they're large emerging market countries, but there are significant, issues between them. For those that don't know, and this is quite an interesting thing if you want to look into it, India and China have a dispute in the Himalayas, around about the borders between the two countries. When you have borders in the middle of very high mountains that nobody lives in, they can be, quite fuzzy for a long time. But nowadays, of course, with GPS, we want to get things to a bit more clarity. And the problem is that, people, both sides are claiming the most optimistic possible version of their country, and therefore there's overlap. And the weird thing, and this is the funny thing, I want you guys to, if you look into it, they don't want to do a shooting war. They don't want to get involved in like a firefight. So they don't use guns. They literally fight with like melee weapons. If you look at like clubs and stuff. And so they train themselves. They're like, it's like a LARPing session. It's like, medieval kind of like things here. At one point in time, they had a rock fight. They had a stone throwing fight between the two armies, or the soldiers of each army here. And like a serious one, people died, but still it was a rock throwing fight. With soldiers from two nuclear armed powers. Two powers, by the way, who are spacefaring. India just sent a rocket to the moon, landing on the south pole of the moon. Something, by the way, which the Russians just recently failed to do. So it's not exactly like it's a minor thing, but it's an impressive thing. But just weirdly that they are fighting with stones effectively on the border. But what it comes back to is this, that there is no strong cooperation in terms of all fields between the BRICS countries. If the BRICS countries were like the EU, if the BRICS countries were like a strong alliance, like for instance like NATO, then there'd be a formidable alliance, maybe the most formidable alliance in the world. You'd have the world's largest nuclear arsenal with Russia. You'd have a couple other nuclear powers there with India and China. You'd have the massive amounts of the world's natural resources of places like, I said, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, and Russia, and so on included. You'd have the biggest population of any group with India and China pulling the bulk of that there. You'd have pretty much huge geographic dispersal across South America, across Africa, across Asia, across across the Eurasia. We're talking about a gigantic, incredibly powerful group. Unfortunately, the cooperation between these countries are not there. And so when people talk about things like a BRIC currency, or people talk about things like, this is a counterweight to the US, understand that there is not a counterweight to the US because, Israel, Saudi Arabia, huge dependency on the US at the moment. The US has bases in Saudi Arabia. I mean, think of how dependent you are on a country when their military literally has permanent bases in your country. And you guys are at war. They just basically, provide you with security. You don't have your own security. So no, this is a big, group, but the cohesion makes it not a very significant group, I would believe, going forward. Maybe in the future it might be. I mean, you look at the European Union, 50, 60 years ago, who could have imagined, this is basically back in the 1940s, 1950s, who would have imagined that Germany and, France and, Italy would be the closest of allies, almost like the same country. This was just after World War II, but they are. And these kind of things do take a life of their own. If you have BRICS going on for long enough, and if there's significant political will on every side, you could see maybe in 20, 30 years' time, BRICS really becoming a much more cohesive, a much more powerful organization. But it requires that kind of time. Right now, it is not that power. Okay, now for our deep dive. The deep dive this week is going into Nvidia's results. And I wanted to look at Nvidia's results to some stuff around AI. Okay, so Nvidia basically, as you know, makes chips, and doesn't make chips, sorry, designs chips, and it's like the premier designer of chips for the world. They kind of outsource the actual manufacturing of the chips to a Chinese company. So what Nvidia has done so far is they produce a kind of chip that's best designed for AI, or best suited to AI, not best designed, but best suited to AI. It's graphics cards. It's basically the stuff that makes your video games on your computer look better. We see guys with these big screen computers and like they're playing very fast games, and there's like wonderful graphics on the screen. They usually have a graphics cards, and they used to specialize in graphics cards. And they tell that the graphics cards were useful for other things as well because they'll do what's called parallel processing. They can do more than one a lot of processing at a time. And that made them useful not just for graphics, but also for things like mining cryptocurrencies. And so for a long time, Nvidia was based on the crypto, hype. And when the crypto hype basically, collapsed a couple of years ago, Nvidia's share price came down. But then, of course, we had the emergence of AI, and it turns out the same kind of computing infrastructure, like the architecture that's suitable for crypto and for graphics cards, makes your computer go, show these beautiful pictures, etc., and beautiful video, can also be adapted for AI, and it's actually the best sort of thing for AI. And so Nvidia's cards became highly in demand for developing these AI systems, and they've seen a huge increase in the amount of demand for the things. In fact, right now there is more than a 6-month waiting period to get the kind of huge quantities of chips that people want out there to build these massive kind of like supercomputers almost that can train AI. So Nvidia benefiting massively from the AI revolution. Came out with results significantly better than expected, and the market was expecting significantly good results. The market's been like 50% improved, they got like 80%, and they improved every single quarter, going forward in terms of the expectations. It's up all the expectations. Very, very good results. And the question that arises is why, what's happening in Nvidia, and why is Nvidia so powerful, and what is basically going to be the ultimate, valuation of this company? It depends on a couple of things. But firstly, why is Nvidia so in demand right now? Because they have effectively a monopoly on the kind of chips that you basically need to produce, the modern AI systems. And everybody in the world wants AI systems, not just every tech company, virtually every significant entity out there. We're talking countries are buying. The UK bought, I think, 100 million pounds worth of chips. The Saudis, the UAE are buying tons and tons of chips. I don't know what the Chinese are doing right now, but I can almost guarantee that the Chinese have some pathway to access these chips as well. You have a huge demand for the chips, number one. Number two, these guys have a lead and they are building on that lead. They're coming up with a new architecture next year. They'll call the Hopper architecture. They're going to have a chip called the Grace Hopper chip, based on named after some admiral from the US that was really famous in the early days of computers. Anyway, this new architecture, this new chip that they're coming out with, could give them an unassailable lead, because what's it going to be like? It's, you have Apple computers, you have PCs. Apple is like a proprietary thing where there's like a limited, like the amount of nobody else can make an Apple kind of computer with technology, etc. Whereas PCs, the guys that made it, like IBM, have let it basically be made by anybody. So a lot of people make PCs, and Windows are everywhere. Windows is used more often than, for instance, Mac OS. But if you are a Windows kind of user, you don't really want to shift over to Mac. If you're a Mac user, you want to shift over to Windows. Why? Because your programs won't work the same. You're not used to how things work, etc. And this is what they're trying to establish with chips right now. They are making a kind of proprietary kind of chipset that's going to be more like the Apple kind of thing, where only programs that are designed for this particular chip will work on it and will not work on other computers, right? So they are creating an architecture that's going to basically allow people who program for it to program only for it, and they can't just take those programs and adjust it to another set of chips out there made by somebody else. You do that for a couple of years, and people get used to your system, get used to your technology. They figure out all the little tips and little tricks and whatever might be to make it work better. Then when somebody else comes along, they have to be so much better than you for people to shift. You can't be 10-20% better for people to shift in this scenario. You have to be like double, 3 times as good, and then people might shift because they'll be so used to the current technology that they're using. And because Nvidia, like I said, has this advanced start, it's quite possible they turn out to be the monopoly AI hardware provider. And why this is important, and this is why I'm thinking that you need to basically look at Nvidia for the longer term, is that Goldman Sachs came out with a report, and they said basically that over the next few years, okay, we're going to see a massive uptick in the amount of spending on AI. So for the year 2025, this is basically a year and a half from now, 2025, they expect global, semiconductor, global investment in AI is going to be $160 billion. Okay, $160 billion global investment in AI. If the way it's looking right now is that a significant chunk of the majority of that money is going to go to Nvidia, because right now The money that's going into AI is primarily going into the chips. The guys that are doing things like Mistral and Inflection and so on, these new startup companies, are primarily buying the chips. Okay? And there's going to be $160 billion of investment happening there. Yes, someone's going to go to these AI scientists, someone's going to be developing software, but the actual capital requirements are going to be Nvidia AI chips. Okay? So we could be looking at tens of billions of new demand coming in over the next couple of years for Nvidia. The next thing is that looking forward like to 2030, according to Goldman Sachs again, they're looking at somewhere in the region of about $1.5 trillion of investment going into AI. It's a huge amount of money. And like I said, in all likelihood, Nvidia is going to get a big chunk of that. And unless somebody comes out with a chip that's comparable to what Nvidia is offering at the moment, they may get the lion's share of that new investment. So that makes them a very valuable company. Okay. So that is why Nvidia's share price, even though it's high at the moment and has a huge, it's price to equity ratio, etc., might still be a good buy. That's what we have in our AI portfolio, by the way, and we've had it from the start. Okay, thanks for joining me. Look forward to speaking to you guys again next week, and have a good weekend. Cheers.